Good morning. My name is Ethan Rittenauer. I am an educator for the Artesian Alliance, which is Cheehaw Park and Zoo, the Flint River Aquarium, and the Thronatiska Heritage Center here in Albany, Georgia. I'm coming to you today from the Cheehaw Park and Zoo, and we are going to talk about um, motion, movement, how animals move. So today we're specifically going to talk about two more specific kinds of movement. They're a little bit more unique. Um, um, we are going to be talking about undulation, and we're going to be talking about brachiation. So to start, we're gonna start with undulation, and I actually have an animal. Before I even tell you what undulation is, I have an animal that I want to show you, and maybe it will give you a better idea of what I'm going to be describing whenever I describe undulation. So give me 1 second here, and I'm going to grab the animal. This is a corn snake, sometimes called a red rat snake. They're very common in Georgia. They're found all over the place, and they're called corn snakes because of this beautiful corn coloring on the bottom of their bodies here. And also because they can sometimes be found in cornfields because they like to hunt things like mice and small rodents and things like that. Corn snakes uh, are an undulator. In fact, all snakes undulate. Um, Undulation is the term for that sort of wavy movement side to side that creatures do. A lot of animals incorporate undulation into their movement. So pretty much every animal undulates some of the time, but creatures like snakes and worms and eels and things, they all use undulation exclusively. They use it for their main form of movement. So what these guys will do is whenever they're on the ground, they will undulate by wiggling, basically just wiggling back and forth, and they will make their way across the ground. They can climb, these snakes can climb trees. It's pretty cool how they do it. They will wrap themselves around a tree and then work different parts of their muscles up, just slowly rotating themselves around this tree. And undulation is a great method of movement for covering difficult terrain because you can maneuver your way across a lot of different kinds of ground and terrain to do it. So like you might be able to undulate up over rocky areas. You might be able to undulate across an open field. You can even undulate to sort of dig your way a little bit into mud as you're going across a pond. There's all kinds of things, and undulation is very common in aquatic animals as well. So I mentioned things like eels. A lot of worms are aquatic. They undulate, and it helps them to move through the water. You've seen fish undulate a little bit whenever they kind of wiggle to take off. They push themselves forward using their tails. And so that's a type of undulation as well. But snakes, I think, are the coolest undulators, but that's just my personal opinion. Um, so undulation is kind of it's simultaneously very basic and very specialized at the same time. The idea of undulation is a very basic concept, right? You don't need any limbs to undulate, you just kind of wiggle. But undulation can get more and more specialized as you go. Snakes, for instance, are very specialized undulators. They have muscles all along their bodies that help them to be able to move and maneuver and all kinds of stuff. And as you can see, this snake is very good at wrapping around my arm. And they use their undulation to move very quickly. Water snakes use it to get across the water very quickly. You even get some very specialized kinds of undulation with snakes, with things like sidewinders, which if you've ever seen a sidewinder go across a desert in like a video or maybe in person, you'll notice that, as the name suggests, they move sideways as they undulate. And that's them taking advantage of the sand and a very, very specific method of undulating to do it. So undulating is a very, very, it's found in a lot of creatures. I think sometimes we think of it as something more primitive, but in reality, it can be an extremely specialized method of movement. So I am going to put our resident undulator here, our corn snake, back. And then we're going to talk about another method of movement, kind of similar to undulation, in that some creatures do it, and it's very, very specialized. So give me 1 second here. All right. So the other type of movement that I want to talk about today is brachiation. And brachiation, I'm going to share a PowerPoint with you guys, and we're going to talk a little bit more about brachiation. So give me 1 second here, and I'm going to share my screen. So brachiation. What is brachiation? Brachiation is swinging. It's when animals swing in order to move. A lot of animals brachiate at some point, but most primates use brachiation as their main means of travel. So very similar to how undulation sort of seems to have been specialized, and only a lot of very specific creatures use it, things like leeches, eels, agnathans, which are a type of fish, snakes, and a couple other creatures, annelids, worms, use it to maneuver around. Brachiation is also kind of a very specialized thing. Only a few animals use brachiation exclusively. So most primates use brachiation as a means of travel, because a lot of primates are what's known as arboreal, which means that they live in trees. And some primates, such as gibbons are actually the most arboreal species of primate. They use it for up to 80% of their movement on any given day is brachiation. So whenever I describe brachiation, what I'm talking about is that motion. You do it on the monkey bars whenever you're younger on playgrounds. You grab, and then you reach forward and you grab, and you reach forward and you grab. And that sort of motion where whenever you let go, you sort of swing like a pendulum forward. That is what I'm describing whenever I'm talking about brachiation here. And I actually have a great example of brachiation. I found a video from a zoo showing off gibbon brachiating. So that's what I'm talking about whenever I'm describing brachiation. So that's brachiation right there, in case my description wasn't good enough. That gibbon is swinging and moving from one to one, from post to post, as if he was in a tree. In this case, it's a bamboo rig, but he would be doing this in trees if it was out in a jungle. And there are a couple different ways that that primates brachiate. And we're going to talk about those. But before we do, let's talk about why would you want to brachiate. So there's a lot of different kinds of movement. There's terrestrial movement, where a lot of creatures are quadrupeds. They use all four limbs to move around, and they're running. that's usually pretty good for running. There's undulation, which I just mentioned, which is great for handling rough terrain and maneuvering across all kinds of stuff, and is also great for water. But what is brachiation good for? Well, it's really good for living in trees. You can reach up, you use your arms to move and get around. Some primates use all four limbs to brachiate. So orangutans, for instance, they use their arms and their legs to brachiate. Other creatures only really rely on their hands mostly. It's great for living in trees. It allows you to only use some of your limbs as well. So you can actually brachiate perfectly fine with only your hands, and then it leaves your legs open to do other stuff. So like you've probably seen monkeys like carrying fruit in their legs and brachiating with their hands, and then whenever they finally find a good spot to eat their fruit, they'll grab it from their leg and eat it. It's a lot more efficient if you want to handle things than say being a quadruped, like a leopard climbing a tree. A leopard's not going to be able to grab anything in the tree very well. It's going to have to rely on its mouth to grab things and all kinds of other stuff. So it gives you more freedom to reach for things. Another reason why brachiation is so good is, in case you didn't notice from that gibbon in the last video, you can move really quick with brachiation, and it's really hard to follow. So imagine you are a monkey hanging out in a tree and a leopard's climbing up the tree. You're going to get away, right? You're going to swing around. You're going to swing from branch to branch, and this leopard is going to have a really hard time chasing you down because it just doesn't move that way. So it keeps you high up so you can see whenever predators are coming from the ground. It can help you avoid predators. It can also make you really maneuverable if you're trying to catch things. It's just a whole lot more useful in a tree environment, in an arboreal environment. So let's talk a little bit about sort of how brachiation works. So all animals that use brachiation share a couple things in common. They all generally have a short spine. That means that like their lumbar, which is the lower spine, there's usually not a lot of space between their rib cage and their hip bone. They also tend to have fingernails instead of claws. So instead of these sharp claws for grabbing and digging and all kinds of other stuff that claws are used for, they tend to instead rely on shorter fingernails and long fingers. So they use these long fingers to grab. They're excellently designed for grabbing tree branches. They have reduced thumbs. So like on a cheetah's or a cat or a dog or any of these guys that have individual fingers, their thumbs are right up there with the rest of them, right? But on primates and other brachiators, their thumbs are a lot smaller. They also have very long forelimbs, which is just going to help with brachiating. You know, longer limbs means you can reach further. And they have freely rotating wrists, which is not something that a lot of animals have. They have freely rotating wrists, so they can twist their wrist back and forth and reach for things and grab things at different angles. If any of these qualities or all of these qualities sound very familiar, then that's because we have every single one of the things that I just described. We are designed for brachiation. And we'll talk about that a little bit more here. So there are two big types of brachiation. There's continuous contact and there's ricochettal. So let's talk about continuous contact first, because it's probably the one that you used whenever you climb on monkey bars. There's always a point of contact with continuous contact, as the name suggests. What happens is you reach up and then you reach forward and grab whatever the next thing is in front of you, and then you let go, and the momentum of just your body is going to swing you forward, and then you're going to rely on that momentum to grab the next thing, and then the momentum to grab the next thing. And basically, you're conserving a lot of energy because you're just swinging. You're just conserving that forward momentum and just using your arms to keep yourself steady as you're moving forward. Um, that's very similar to how humans actually walk. We just don't use our arms, we use our legs. You step one step forward, and then you rely on gravity to, whenever you walk, you're essentially just falling, but very controlled. You're controlling yourself. So you take a step forward and you're leaning forward and your center of mass is moving forward. And so then you take another step forward and you just keep that forward momentum as you walk. They brachiators do the same thing. It's just with their arms. And I bet you this is exactly what you did on the monkey bars whenever you were maybe a little bit younger on the playground. I want you to think back to whenever the last time you used monkey bars were. And if you haven't used them in a while and you don't remember, go find some monkey bars and give it a try here. I think whenever I did monkey bars, whenever I was a little bit younger and I played on the playground, I remember very distinctly it being way easier if you kept moving than if you stopped and then had to start again. And that's because of that forward momentum that's helping you out. It's just like walking. So the next one is Ricochettal. It is faster than continuous contact, and it doesn't always involve contact. It involves sort of leaping from handhold to handhold. So let's say that you're moving, continuous motion, and you're getting pretty far forward, and you can now take longer strides, essentially, with your arms because you're moving forward. And what actually happens is, because you're taking these longer strides and you're swinging a lot faster, you're sort of launching yourself. You're ricocheting and grabbing hold of things maybe after you've let go. So you're just in the air, free flying. So it's very similar to like running, right? It's a very whip-like motion. And actually, if we go back to that gibbon, he does it a few times on here. So you can see here, once he gets a little bit faster, you'll see it. Yep, you can see how he's letting go before he's grabbing hold. It's a very whip-like situation. Yeah, that's a good demonstration of both kinds of movement there. But yeah, those are the two big ones. They'll either just move kind of slowly, keeping their momentum, which if you noticed, even whenever that gibbon was moving slow, it was moving pretty fast. You can move very quickly as a brachiator. And then whenever it wanted to speed up a little bit, it was kind of pushing itself a little bit more and getting more into the swings and reaching forward before it had actually reached the point. So let's talk a little bit about us, because believe it or not, we are brachiators, or at least we were. We're really, really well designed for brachiation, even though we walk on two legs on the ground. And so let's talk about maybe why and how we are so good at brachiation. So I'm going to talk about a term called exaptation. And exaptation sounds very similar to adaptation because it is very similar to adaptation. So adaptation is whenever you develop a trait for a specific purpose, right? So an example of an adaptation would be our lungs to breathe air. Not all creatures have lungs. Some creatures have developed gills to breathe air underwater. Or another adaptation that a creature might have is, for instance, snakes are very well adapted to undulation. They've grown very long, slender bodies to be able to move by undulating. Birds have wings to fly. These are all examples of adaptations. An exaptation is a slightly different thing. It is what happens. It is the term that we use for whenever a trait has been developed for one purpose, but then gets co-opted to serve another purpose. The term, while the term was developed a lot later, the first time that anybody had observed this was with Charles Darwin. So Charles Darwin actually observed exaptation in finches. He saw that some finches had grown these very long beaks for grabbing berries and other tree bits, but were using it for other purposes as well, such as moving brush out of the way. So some examples of an exaptation are feathers being developed. Feathers were developed in the Mesozoic era by dinosaurs as a way to regulate heat. And over time, as dinosaurs adapted into birds, into just full-blown birds, they became specialized for flight. So these very special hairs, because that's basically what a feather is, it's a very specialized kind of hair. These feathers were just adapted further and further and further until they became specialized for flight. Some animals use it for mating rituals. Some penguins even use things like penguins use it for heat and as its intended purpose, and also to keep themselves waterproof. So they began as one thing and then sort of got co-opted into doing other stuff. An example of a behavioral exaptation is wolves and dogs. Wolves lick the mouths of other wolves as a sign of submissiveness. If a wolf wants to show a different wolf that they're the boss, they're going to lick their mouth. And if any of you guys have ever gotten close to a dog's face with your face, you'll note that dogs do exactly the same thing. It's a behavioral exaptation. Dogs licking your face is a trait that was developed for one purpose that has been co-opted to do another one. And in that exact same vein, us humans use our limbs for bipedal movement. We've got these long legs and these long arms, and we actually are really, really well adapted for brachiation, but we don't do a lot of brachiation. What we do instead is throwing. We use all of these adaptations that we developed for brachiating, for climbing and swinging along trees, and instead use them for throwing. And we are actually really, really good at throwing. So our arms are developed for throwing things. Our entire bodies are just really, really well developed for throwing. And it's because we were basically designed to swing from tree to tree just over time. So as I was saying, bipedalism actually has we're one of the only species that is truly bipedal. We walk on two legs, which is what bipedal means. Quadrupedal is something that you might hear thrown around. That means that they walk on four legs. A lot of creatures walk on four legs. Brachiation seems to be a key step towards developing bipedalism. So the argument goes that we would not be walking on two legs if it wasn't for the fact that we learned how to swing with two arms first. And we can see evidence of that in some of our closer cousins. So large great apes like gorillas alternate between they're terrestrial, they live on the ground, and they alternate between bipedal and quadrupedal movement. So great apes are kind of sort of there, like gorillas. They sometimes can be bipedal, but they often use their knuckles for walking around as quadrupeds. Chimpanzees, which are actually genetically the closest species to us. Chimpanzees and bonobos are both very, very similar genetically to humans. They tend to walk on their knuckles, but they can walk fully upright as well if they want to. And then they sort of alternate between living on the ground and living up in trees. They move around on trees a lot, so they do that brachiation across trees, and they walk on their knuckles. Orangutans, they can walk bipedally, but they tend to use brachiation to move around as well. So at some point, whenever humans were developing, we started focusing way more on bipedal movement. So we started to stand more upright. And so now all of these things in our upper body, like our arms, our long arms, and our extremely tactile fingers and hands, which can rotate. Um, all of these things no longer are serving much of a purpose for moving around um, above in trees. So instead, we began to develop them more for things like hunting. So human hunting, this is actually the image that I have down here is a hunter using an atlatl, which is a type of, it's like a very special stick that you would stick a short spear onto, and then you would throw the stick and it would make the spear go further. And it's actually a very common piece of technology. It was developed separately by nearly every group of human. It was really specialized in the New World, which is why it has the name atlatl. It's a Native American name. But as we became terrestrial instead of arboreal, we started developing hunting techniques. We developed ways, we were using tools, and we would develop things like spears. Spears are designed to be thrown. We would chuck spears at prey. We would throw things. We're really, really good at throwing things because of the way that we stand upright. Our center of mass is a little bit higher than on some of our cousins, like the chimpanzee. Their center of mass is a lot lower. Gorillas have a lower center of mass. Our center of mass is a little bit higher, which is why we're able to stand and walk. And because we are able to stand and walk and our center of mass is a little bit higher, whenever we throw, we are able to keep ourselves upright, basically. If a gorilla tried to throw something the way that humans throw something, it would fall over on its face. The same is true with a lot of creatures. Chimpanzees, they can do a little bit better job, but humans are probably the best throwers in the entire animal kingdom. So these arms are now exapted. We have an exaptation. So these long arms designed for brachiation, combined with our higher center of mass, makes us extremely well suited to throwing things. So that is actually why we developed spears. We became such excellent hunters because of all of these exaptations that we have. So let's go over everything again. We talked about undulation at first, which I know doesn't sound a whole lot like brachiation, but they're very kind of similar ways of moving. We talked about undulation and how it was good for maneuvering around. A lot of different creatures use undulation. And then we talked about a much more specialized kind of movement, which is brachiation. As far as we know, only primates exclusively use brachiation as a main form of traveling around. A couple other creatures use brachiation from time to time, but they tend to be adapted for slightly different kinds of movement. Brachiation, though, in primates is really strong. Things like New World monkeys, like spider monkeys and stuff, and gibbons, as we talked about, and even some of the great apes like orangutans and even humans are very well designed for brachiation. So I hope that was informative, and I thank you all for coming, and I will see you next time. Thank you.